Max had waited for 5 long years. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, he would lift his head, ears twitching, and listen intently for the sound of the front door opening. He knew that sound all too well. It was the sound of Sarah coming home. But each day, as the minutes turned into hours, that sound never came. He would return to his spot by the window, his eyes scanning the street, hoping, praying that today might be different. It wasn't just an ordinary wait. Max's body had grown older with the years, his fur graying around his muzzle, his eyes a little more tired, but his heart had never wavered. Every evening he would rest his head on the same spot, right by the door, as if the very place where Sarah last stood might somehow bring her back to him. He would curl up there, the empty space beside him where she used to sit. Now, only a painful reminder of the years gone by. Sarah had promised him she would return. She had always kept her promises. They had shared so many good times together. Walks in the park, lazy afternoons on the couch, and even the quiet moments when Sarah would just sit and talk to him, telling him about her day. Max remembered every little thing about her, the way she would laugh, the sound of her voice when she called him, her scent when she would kneel beside him, her hands gently scratching behind his ears. Those memories were etched in his mind like a treasured photo album that he would revisit every day. But now, the house was too quiet. It had been too quiet for too long. Max had been waiting when she left. He remembered that day as if it were yesterday. It had been a bright morning, the kind where the air felt fresh and full of promise. Sarah had knelt down in front of him, her eyes full of sorrow, but also a certain kind of strength. She had hugged him tightly, whispering, "I'll be back soon, Max. Wait for me." Those were her last words before she walked out the door. Max had watched her go, his tail wagging a little, hoping she was just going to the store. But then the car had driven off, and the quiet had settled in, and it never lifted. Days turned into weeks, then into months. Every day Max held on to that hope. Sometimes when the doorbell rang, or when he heard a car drive by, his heart would race. He would leap to his feet, his ears perked, his tail wagging in excitement. But each time, it wasn't her. The excitement faded, and the hope would shrink a little more. Still, he waited. It was all he knew how to do. Even though the days were long and the nights even longer, Max never gave up. The world outside changed, seasons came and went, but Max's routine remained the same. He would eat, sleep, and wait. Waiting was all that mattered. There was no other reason for his days, just the hope that Sarah would come back through the door. He never stopped looking. Even as his body grew older, Max's love for Sarah never faded. It couldn't. He couldn't imagine a life without her. Then, one cold winter evening, something happened that made his heart skip a beat. Max had been lying on the floor, just as he always did, when he heard a sound, a car pulling up outside. He jumped up, his paws scrambling against the floor, his heart racing in his chest. Could it be? Was it her? Max rushed to the window, his nose pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up as he tried to see through the haze. There was a car parked out front, just like the one Sarah used to drive. His tail thumped on the floor, the sound echoing in the quiet room. It had to be her. But as the minutes passed, Max stood there, frozen in place. No one got out of the car. No one walked up to the door. The car just sat there, and then, with a slow turn of the engine, it drove away. Max's heart sank. He watched it disappear down the street, the feeling of hope that had flared up just moments ago, now crushed like a fragile flower underfoot. He let out a soft whimper, his head hanging low, but he didn't give up. He couldn't. Max returned to his spot by the door. The promise that Sarah had made echoed in his mind, but it was getting harder to hold on to. He lay down and closed his eyes, his body exhausted from the weight of waiting. The hope that he had clung to for so long was starting to feel like a distant dream. But deep inside, Max knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until she came home. And so, Max waited. As Max settled into his routine of waiting, something inside him held on to the sliver of hope that Sarah would walk through the door. It was this hope that got him through each day. His senses remained alert, always listening for any sign that might indicate her return. The familiar sound of a car engine, the jingle of keys, the sound of footsteps approaching the door, all these kept his spirit alive, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. The neighborhood had begun to change around him. New families moved in, and old ones left. But Max's vigil by the window never wavered. Children in the neighborhood knew him as the dog who watched and waited. They would sometimes stop by the window, pressing their small hands against the glass, trying to offer him some comfort. Max would wag his tail gently, appreciating the company, but his eyes would soon return to the road, fixed and unblinking, filled with longing. One day, a new neighbor noticed Max's routine. Mrs. Thompson, who had moved into the house next door, saw him every day by the window. Her heart went out to him, and she started bringing him food and fresh water, making sure he was fed and cared for. She would sit with him some afternoons, stroking his head, saying soothing words. "You're a good boy, Max. She'll come back. You'll see." Her kindness was a small comfort in his long wait. Months turned into years, and with each passing day, Max grew a little weaker, a little slower. His joints ached, and his steps were no longer sprightly. Yet, every morning, he took his place by the window, his gaze steady. The house felt emptier as time passed, the silence louder, and the echoes of the past more distant. Sarah's scent had faded from the pillows and the couch, but not from Max's memory. He remembered everything: her laugh, her stride, the soft way she said his name. Then, one chilly evening, as Max lay by his usual spot near the door, something unusual happened. He was drifting in and out of sleep when a soft sound caught his attention. It was faint, almost like a whisper, something he hadn't heard in a long time. His ears perked up, and his tired eyes opened wide. The sound of keys jingling at the door startled him, and his heart began to race. Could it be? After all these years? Max struggled to his feet, his body stiff from lying down for so long. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped in. It wasn't Sarah, not the Sarah he remembered. This person was older, the face lined with years of stories untold, the hair grayer. But the eyes were the same. They held the same warmth, the same love. Max's tail began to wag, cautiously at first, then more vigorously. The woman knelt down as tears started to stream down her cheeks. "Max," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm home, my sweet boy. I'm so sorry it took me so long." Max didn't hesitate. With all the strength he could muster, he moved toward her, his old body shaking. When he reached her, he pressed his head against her chest, and she wrapped her arms around him. They stayed like that for a long time, each comforting the other, sharing the silent language of unconditional love. Sarah had returned, but she was not the same. She had been through an ordeal that had changed her. It turned out she had been in an accident far from home and had spent years recovering in a distant hospital, unable to communicate. Her journey back had been long and fraught with challenges, but throughout it all, she had clung to the thought of returning to Max, her loyal companion, who she hoped had waited for her. As they sat together, Sarah told Max about her journey, about the days she feared she would never see him again. Max listened, his head in her lap, occasionally looking up into her eyes, reassuring her with gentle licks that he understood, that it was okay. The past years had been tough for both of them, each in their own solitude, but now, reunited, the wait seemed like a distant memory. That evening, the house filled with warmth that had been missing for too long. Max finally had his Sarah back, and as they settled down to sleep, side by side, there was a sense of peace. The long wait was over, and though the years had taken their toll, the bond they shared was unbreakable. Max knew this was where he was meant to be, by Sarah's side, forever home at last. She used to call his name when it was time for their walks. Even now, when the silence became unbearable, Max would lift his head at the slightest sound, certain it was her. The sound of the mailman's footsteps on the porch would make his ears perk up, and his tail would wag for a moment. But it was always a disappointment. The door never opened to reveal the one face he had been waiting for. The man opened the door wider and stepped inside. He had a kind face, but Max didn't recognize him. "Hey, boy," the man said gently, kneeling down in front of Max. His voice was warm, but there was a sadness in it that made Max's heart ache. "I'm sorry it took so long, but she's gone. Sarah, she's never coming back." Max's world seemed to tilt, his legs almost giving out beneath him. He wanted to bark, to run to the door, to look outside for her, to ignore the man's words, but something in his gut told him this was the truth he'd been refusing to face all these years. The man sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair, his face showing the same heartache that Max felt in his chest. She she loved you so much, boy. She wanted to come back. She promised, but his voice trailed off as tears welled up in his eyes. Max stood frozen, his body trembling with a grief he could not understand. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept that Sarah wouldn't come through that door, that this man would be the one to tell him the truth. He sat down in front of the man, his tail hanging limply behind him. He had waited for so long, 5 years of silent devotion, and now the reality he had fought to ignore had finally broken through. The man reached out, gently placing a hand on Max's head, offering comfort. But there was no replacing the absence of Sarah. Max let out a low whine, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "I'm sorry," the man whispered again, and then, slowly, he stood up. "I'm going to make sure you're okay, Max. You don't have to wait anymore." But Max didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the door, his body frozen in place, unwilling to let go of the past. The man sighed, his face full of sorrow, before he walked out, leaving Max alone once more. The door closed softly behind him, and Max was left in the quiet that had become his constant companion. But even now, deep inside, Max still believed. He still believed that Sarah would walk through that door one day, and that all the years of waiting would finally pay off. The years had taken their toll, and the truth had shattered his heart, but hope, the hope that he would see her again, never truly left him. It wasn't over. Not for Max. Not yet. Max stood there, motionless, as the man's words sank in, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The room, once filled with hope and anticipation, now felt hollow. The scent of Sarah was still faint in the air, lingering like a ghost of the past. Max couldn't understand. His mind raced, but his body couldn't move. It felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, and everything he had believed in had crumbled away in an instant. The man reached out, his hand gently resting on Max's head. "I'm sorry, boy. She loved you so much," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Max didn't know who this man was, but he could feel the sadness in his touch, the heaviness in his voice. It wasn't the same as Sarah's voice. It wasn't the same warmth, the same reassurance. But it was enough to make Max lower his head, defeated, as the truth washed over him like a cold wave. The man stood up, walking to the corner of the room where a small box rested. He picked it up carefully, as though it held something precious, something fragile. Max's eyes followed every movement. The man opened the box, revealing a picture frame inside. It was a photo of Sarah, smiling as she hugged Max tightly, her face glowing with love, the same photo Max had carried in his heart for years. "She loved you," the man said again, his voice breaking slightly. "She never forgot you, Max. She just couldn't come back, but she left this for you." The man placed the photo on the floor in front of Max, and for the first time in years, the dog's heart broke. Not from the endless waiting, but from the truth he had been avoiding all along. Sarah wasn't coming back. She couldn't. Max looked at the picture, his eyes welling with tears he couldn't shed. He sniffed at the photo, his nose brushing the edges of the frame. His heart ached as the memories of Sarah flooded back. Her laughter, the way she would scratch behind his ears, the days when they would be together forever, or so it seemed. But now it was just him. Alone. The man stood back, his gaze filled with sorrow as he watched Max stare at the photo. He knew what this moment meant for the dog. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, before turning to leave the room. Max didn't move, his body frozen, still watching the photo. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds turning into minutes, the minutes into hours. But Max stayed by the door, waiting, just waiting for the one thing he had hoped for all these years, Sarah's return. Yet deep down, in his heart, he knew it would never come. The years of waiting had been in vain, but Max had loved her with everything he had, and that love, even in silence, would remain. Forever. As Max gazed at the photo, a quiet realization settled in. The years of waiting, the endless hope, the belief that Sarah would walk through the door, none of it could bring her back. But there, in the silence of the room, Max understood one final thing. She had loved him until the very end. And that love, no matter how painful, would live on in his heart forever. With a heavy but resolute sigh, Max slowly lowered his head and curled up next to the picture, his body exhausted from years of waiting. His eyes closed gently, but his spirit felt at peace, as though he no longer needed to wait for a door to open, because he carried Sarah's love with him in every breath. As the camera pulled back, a sense of quiet finality hung in the air. The man stepped away, leaving Max to rest in the comfort of his memories. But the story didn't end here. Max's loyalty, his waiting, his love, they weren't just stories to be told. They were lessons about love, loss, and the courage to let go. If you've ever waited for someone, held onto a memory, or loved unconditionally, Max's story is for you. Remember, sometimes love isn't about waiting for someone to come back. It's about cherishing the moments shared and carrying their love forward, no matter where they are. Thank you for watching Max's journey. Share his story, and remember, love lasts longer than the waiting.